I'm Cynthia Williams. I run OutsideTheBook.com, and I'm a senior editor at Dragonfly Editorial. I want to welcome you to the Talking Proper podcast, a show for editors who know the basics but crave nuance. We'll be talking with academics who study editing and discussing world Englishes, standard English, and the power dynamics in editing. I hope these episodes expand for you what editing is and how we can communicate better with our writers. Hi, my guest for this episode is Dr. David Owen, an associate professor at the University of Barcelona. He teaches English literature and the history and culture of English-speaking countries. Today we're discussing his article, Native Here and to the Manner Born, Academic Publishing and Proper English. Welcome, David. How are you doing?
Very well, Cynthia. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So let's dive in.
Sure.
So if one is an academic, one of the ways that they would advance their research or communicate with colleagues and even progress in their careers is through publishing in scholarly journals.
That's right, yeah.
And so that could be a feat for even seasoned researchers. But you say that non-native English speakers have this unique challenge of having a task of more than just writing articles for their research. You describe it as a double task. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, absolutely. I call it the double bind because non-native speakers of English who have to publish in English, which is a very considerable percentage of most academics in a worldwide audience, because of course, you can publish in your own language, but your audience is much smaller. So there's a sort of general consensus that to reach a broader academic audience, you need to publish in English. And as you very well say, that's a tough ask for anyone, even for native English speakers. But it's a double bind for non-native speakers of English because they not only have to have a very considerable level of competence within their own academic field, whatever that might be, but they also, in order to reach that global audience, have to have a very, very high level of English too. It's not enough for them just to have a middling level. So they really have to gain mastery over two very distinct but very necessary fields. So it's a double bind and it places them at a disadvantage. So that's what I meant by that.
Right. And this disadvantage, you say, is partly because of language prejudices, right?
That's right, yes.
Right. And what kind of, just go a little bit further into like what that could look like.
Okay, language prejudice is something that is, like a lot of prejudices, it's something that is invisible and made invisible to many people. But for non-native speakers of English, that prejudice tends to take the form of, even when they produce comprehensible, clear, and in some cases objectively error-free language, because it doesn't have those often very subtle stylistic indicators of nativeness, it's looked down on. And not only looked down on, it's often rejected. It's deemed to be inferior. That can, at a linguistic level, that can take the shape of phrasal verbs, prepositional phrases, certain expressions of very, very fine control that for native speakers we don't tend to think about unless we're linguists, over things like the use and non-use of articles before certain nouns. Those kind of things that, don't always, and perhaps don't often, interfere with absolute comprehensibility. But they do mark you as being not part of the native tribe. And so you're excluded in that respect. On a daily basis, that doesn't have any significance at all. In fact, it might even grant you a certain amount of kudos. I mean, we like to hear people speak with a French accent, for example, or we like to hear, somebody speak with an accent that sounds exotic to us. But when it comes to the hard currency of publication, then it can be very detrimental.
And costly, I presume, for researchers who are just starting, maybe to have get someone to review their work also, I imagine.
It's very expensive. Or traditionally it has been. And I think it still is the case. Of course, you need good text editors and they're professionals and they deserve their reward, of course, unquestionably, but it's difficult for young researchers to access that kind of support.
Yeah, and in the article, you cautiously use the term linguistic imperialism.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that term and explain it for our listeners, and maybe explain also why you were hesitant to use it?
Sure. Linguistic imperialism is a term that was coined by an English applied linguist, a guy called Philipson, back in the early 90s, 1992, I think it was, in a book of the same title, Linguistic Imperialism. Linguistic imperialism is, I think, I'm not an applied linguist, but I think within the field of applied linguistics, it's a well-known concept. And it, as the term pretty much suggests, it applies to the way in which a particular language can dominate and colonize other languages and impose itself on them in ways that are anything but egalitarian. And I'm hesitant to use that term because it's not a neutral term. It's a very politicized term. And people generally quite rightly, don't have a positive reaction to the term imperialism. And nobody likes to be called an imperialist. And imperialism has, it's redolent of militarism, of violence and aggression. And to apply that to something like language, when people are usually involved in languages in anything but, violent and aggressive ways, seems to be a little excessive. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought it is exactly what is happening to a lot of non-native speakers in academic publishing. They are the receivers of a form of unthinking but very emphatic linguistic imperialism.
Right. And I imagine not only for the researchers, but maybe there are wider implications to this whole issue, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the wider implications are exactly as you say, Cynthia. It's not simply something that happens at an individual personal level. Of course it does. But the wider implications are to an academic community as a whole. They lose out on equal opportunities in the dissemination of their research. So it does have very, very direct and quite broad implications beyond that.
So one of the parts that I liked in the article was that you presented these 5 case studies, if you will, 5 passages, as they were when they were first submitted by 5 authors, and the passages the articles were rejected because they didn't reflect linguistic fluency.
Exactly.
And you say that all were accepted for publication after they were revised. And so you give the original and then the revision.
Yeah.
And you admit that it's a very small sample size, obviously. It's 5 passages. But what did that exercise reveal to you?
Okay. Thank you for bringing up the sample size, because I do need to emphasize that this is such a tiny sample that anybody who has trained in statistics or sampling would laugh at it. And so I hope that I was sufficiently clear throughout the article to say that I wasn't trying to extrapolate from that. But having said that, what I found from that was that not that editing is a useless process, quite the opposite, because of course, if you looked at the before and after, you could see that those texts had been adapted to a form of academic language that would be perhaps more broadly acceptable. But in pretty much every case, none of those modifications corresponded to a serious problem. They were what I called in the article tweaking. We were kind of fiddling about with these things to make it look more acceptable. But the originals were not incomprehensible. They didn't break any significant grammatical rules. The choice of vocabulary was adequate, and the spelling was fine. And so that begs the question: what are we doing here? Why are we changing that? This is not a question of a first draft of a novel where literary style has to come into play, and is absolutely fundamental to the quality of the final output. We're talking about the dissemination of ideas, and if on top of that we impose an insistence on stylistic level, then non-native speakers are never going to be able to get the same opportunities, and that seems very, very unfair to me.
Right. And you said with this small sample size, you're not trying to extrapolate, but you do allow the writers a chance to give their thoughts on going through these experiences. Can you talk about that and, any responses you've gotten when you've presented this paper to other audiences? Yeah,
that was the fun part. I really, really enjoyed that because, there was a whole procedure where I had to ask permission from the authors to use the before and after fragments. But I also sent out a questionnaire to them, and the answers to the questions are quoted in the article. And I wasn't expecting such a visceral reaction from them. And I realized that I touched a raw nerve. Why I did that was because, curiously, in spite of them being the authors, they are the voice that is excluded from the conversation. So they give us their text. Somebody else handles it for them. It's then published in their name, but it's not really them. It's always at one remove. So I thought it was only fair that they be given the opportunity to speak directly from the heart, as it were. And what they said was really quite profound in some cases. I mean, they felt systematically to be marginalized. And to go to your further question, it's a long time ago, this issue, but I think it was 15 years ago that I published this, and I've moved into a different academic field since then. But I did, tour it around for a little bit, as you do, to various conferences. And the responses were wonderful. It was funny, very few people actually said anything whilst I was, in the sort of question and answer phase. But afterwards, people would come along and say to me, oh, that meant so much to me just to have somebody speak for me. And to have a native speaker speak for them, I think, was also something that they appreciated. Although that was, it wasn't my intention to be a sort of, an evangelical figure on their behalf. I wasn't trying to do that. But the response was really quite visceral, I think is the word.
Yeah, I mean, the quotes from that part of the article, I could go on for days. The one that I did pull out that was just, just kind of got to the nitty-gritty of it was the problem of discerning between language level and true scientific validity on the article's findings. It's like those two things can be separate. So let's just deal with one and then, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Completely, yeah.
And it's interesting for editors also because one of our main goals we tell ourselves is to maintain the author's voice, right? And you're saying it gets published, but it's one removed, right? Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah. Which leads me, we're talking as editors and just other people who are taking in this information or being the text shapers or gatekeepers. Can you talk about the implicit biases involved in the whole issue of linguistic imperialism?
Yes, where to begin? The implicit bias is really quite pernicious because it exists simply by identifying a discrepancy between what's expected and what's produced. So the non-native speaker will produce language and discrepancies will be identified. And those discrepancies are often the almost intangible rhetorical features that mark out nativeness that you and I have been born into, but of almost impossible to learn. And since the text fails to reproduce those, the reviewer's comments are highly negative with respect to that discrepancy and go way beyond any validation of the scientific or the academic content of the novel itself, of the article itself. I'm too used to speaking about novels now. So that the author feels themselves put down twofold. First, linguistically, but by implication, the quality of their science is not up to it as well. And that is, totally unfair because very often when reviewers are rejecting on linguistic grounds, by implication, they're negatively affecting the academic content, but the academic content hasn't even been discussed. And this is where it's even more pernicious. Where it is discussed, it's looked at negatively because the form of expressing it wasn't deemed acceptable. And that is, to take a little bit further your previous comment, that's a terrible injustice because these are people who are very competent scientists doing very competent science whose scientific output is deemed to be secondary because they didn't get their prepositions right.
Right.
It's crazy. It's just crazy.
And you said that they also, if these are seasoned scientists, they've spent much of their academic career reading English and writing English,
yes,
being in that world, right?
Exactly, yeah. Also, I also should add there that they're very competent speakers of English. They're great communicators. You can put them on a stage and they can hold an audience. But of course they can't write the way you and I can. They'll never be able to. It's too late for them already. They would need 2 decades of immersion to be able to do that. That's not what it's about.
And you say that, in the reviewer's mind, there's this almost instinctive belief that natively produced English is the only correct form.
Yes.
And everything else is, looked at as invalid. Yeah.
That is the case.
Yeah. So this is kind of the nitty-gritty that I want editors to hear from you. So what does the world look like, the literary world or just the publications world? What does it look like if English is no longer the exclusive property, as you say, of native English speakers? You say, like, now that its use, modification, evolution now lie in large measure in the hands of millions or keyboards, or millions of users for whom English is not a first language.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Cynthia, and it's a very big one. To give you a trite answer, what the world looks like is much more colourful, and I think much nicer, but that's probably not the answer that your editors are looking for. And I remember, I was an academic text editor for just under 25 years, and I remember right at the beginning of my career when I came across this notion, this is before even before linguistic imperialism became a sort of buzz term, when I came across this notion that English as an international language doesn't belong to the native speakers anymore. And I became instinctively very protective about that. And I thought, no, that's nonsense. That can't possibly be true. I mean, it can only be the native speakers who can tell the rest of the world how to speak it. And over time, my thinking on that has evolved. But I think if any of your editors are feeling that right now, it's an absolutely natural response. And it's not at all illogical to think that. Language norms being shaped and changed by the native speakers, whether they're in the United States or whether they're in the United Kingdom or whether they're in Australia, the native speakers have that power and control. But that is not a sociolinguistic reality. The sociolinguistic reality is that English is used as a lingua franca around the world by, among and between people who might none of them be native speakers. And it's immensely to the advantage of the native speaking countries, hugely to the advantage of the United States or Canada or Britain, that we have this international language, because not just for traveling, but for commerce and for culture, it makes life a lot easier for us. But we can't, on the one hand, reap the benefit of that, and on the other hand, deny the non-native speakers their right to use the language and shape it as they want. So it's a bit like having a child. There comes a point where you've got to let it go and get on with its own life, and you can't keep sticking your nose in what they're doing every weekend because they've left home. You know what I mean?
It follows, though, because Americans have done the same thing. Like, we have turns of phrase and ways of spelling that aren't British English. And so if the Americans can do it, then the Nigerians can do it. And, it's just
that's a very fair point. And I'm sure as Americans, you'll have heard lots of snooty English people saying, no, that's not how you spell color. You need to put a U in it. Or, what is all this Z at the end? The correct English has an S in it, which is, total nonsense, of course. But yes, languages evolve inevitably.
Yeah, inevitably. Right. And you say that it is important to have some kind of linguistic consensus. So, and you think that one will evolve, even, with this, natural instinct where, people who speak American English might say, well, who's going to tell, what's right and what's wrong? But that a consensus may evolve. What do you think that would look like as far as publications?
Sure, that's a great question. You see, the thing about lingua francas is that they can run the risk of evolving in ways that are so distinct that in the end you end up with two different systems. That's something that we don't see in our lifetime, because those things take generations and sometimes even centuries to evolve. And in a world in which communications are far more centralized and automatic and instant, that kind of dispersal is not likely to happen very much. But I think it's illustrative to think of English in comparison to something like Esperanto, which is, this artificial language. It was very popular back in the 1970s and 1980s. And on lots of college campuses, there are kind of Esperanto clubs, and people, they like playing with it, and they like learning this language. And I believe in places like Finland, there's even a couple of native-speaking Esperanto families. Esperanto speakers got together and they had their kids, and they only speak in Esperanto. But it's totally artificial. The idea of Esperanto was that it would be a world language that everyone could share, that hadn't been imposed militarily on anybody, that avoided. So it's a very nice idea. But the problem is that when around the world, when Esperanto got popular back in the 70s, and different countries started to develop it. Very quickly, it started to break down into local dialects. The fact of it being successful led to it being unsuccessful, because success meant developing, growing, evolving.
Yeah.
But it evolved in ways that were different all over the place. And that happened because there were no native speakers to keep it together. So to try and answer your question, what I think would happen with English as a global language is that there is enough collective interest for everyone to make sure that there's sufficient comprehensibility for that not to happen, for it not to break down. And that obviously includes the native speakers who, whether I like it or not, will always come along and say, no, English belongs to us, or what are these guys saying? But it will also include, I think, non-native speakers who will be able to say, this modified form is a successful communicative tool for us, and so we're happy to keep it like that. So it's quite possible that, we might find different variants of international English in the same way that we have different variants of native English.
Right.
You and I speak the same language and we understand each other perfectly, but you don't sound like me and I don't sound like you, and that's not remotely a problem. So I can imagine that might happen with non-native English. What the consequences are for publication, that very much depends on whether the gatekeepers and the power holders are prepared to accept that development and not to insist on conformity with a very limited form of English that doesn't represent anything like the majority of its speakers.
Right. And if it's like that for the majority of speakers, you wonder also on the other side, like, what about the majority of the readers, right? It's, the majority of the
absolutely.
readers will probably, be able to adjust.
I would say so.
Yeah. And your mention of, journal editors and those who, have their hands on the text to guide it to, whatever next stage it's going to go to. Before we get into the next half of the podcast, where we'll talk about the application of these concepts, what are you mentioned that some journals are doing the work of, being a little bit more open to international English. Can you do you have any examples of those who are doing that?
To be honest, I mean, this was, 15 years ago when I wrote the article. At the time, the journals that I was looking at, there were some in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and down here in the Barcelona area of Spain, and in the northwest of Italy as well, I seem to remember. These were academic journals that encouraged open submissions. Native speakers of English, from non-native speakers of English whose texts had been edited, and from non-native speakers of English whose texts hadn't been edited. And they published them equally, so they were quite happy to do that. I am not in a position to tell you if that has developed, if it's still going. I do know that in my own field, which is English literature now, and so it's distinct, I haven't seen any initiative of that kind, and I do have non-native colleagues who have to work very, very hard to get their work published, because the same filters exist. So I suspect that it hasn't taken root, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But it was a nice initiative.
Right. Yeah. And just guessing, I would think that the English literature journals will probably be the last frontier in this area.
the last ones to fall.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a great way for us to wrap up this first half, where we're talking about David Owen's article about native and non-native English speakers and the challenges they face publishing their work. In the second half, we'll talk about what this means for editors and how you can apply some of the concepts that David talks about in his article. This podcast is brought to you by the Serial Comma. Out of breath and don't know when to hit the brakes? Have a Serial Comma. The caramel center melts in your mouth and slows down that chatter. Serial Comma by Big Box Punctuation. Available in stores now. Alrighty, let's see. So now we're going to talk about practical applications for our copy editors who are listening. And I just want to review, because I feel like if I were hearing this for the first time and I was a copy editor, I may have my cactus raised. So I want to calm down our editors and say, what I think the article, major points you're not saying that all papers submitted by non-native English speakers should be accepted outright. And you note that authors do have to make their arguments clearly, and that what you considered text that does need revising is it's poorly structured or poorly expressed and characterized by a high number of like spelling and grammatical errors. So does that sound right?
That's absolutely right. And I mean, I would be very emphatic about that. And if any text editors are listening to us just now and their hackles are raised, I entirely understand that. I am emphatically not saying that we should adopt a laissez-faire attitude so that anything goes. That doesn't make any sense at all. And as a text editor, I rejected my own share of unacceptable text. So a text that is linguistically inadequate in whatever sense, in terms of its lexis, or in terms of its grammar, in terms of its fundamental ability to communicate its ideas, or its organization, or whatever. I'm not trying to defend those kind of texts. I'm not saying that we should give a free pass to those texts simply because they've been written by non-native speakers. My concern is with texts written by non-native speakers that are clear, well-structured, well-organized, use the correct vocabulary, do not contain significant or even any grammatical errors, and are orthographically impeccable, but that stylistically they are unable, because they can never be able to, bring together those intangible rhetorical features that pertain to native language. That's where we need to put the brakes on and think about what we're doing as text editors, because instinctively, and I did this for many, many years, the metaphorical red pen comes out. You just start, underlining things, crossing things out, modifying things, because they don't sound right, because that's not how we say it in English. And that, I think, is a direct way of denying your author's voice. You're imposing another voice in there. And there are very good reasons for doing that. Maybe you've got a really strict deadline. Maybe there's an in-house style. There are lots of reasons. And I'm very, very emphatically not beating the back of text editors because, I'm one of you guys. That's not what it's about. But I think if you haven't worked in a bilingual or a multilingual context, but you receive a non-native speaker's text, it's almost impossible for you to imagine the context in which that was written. So it's normal, it's absolutely normal that, because I imagine a lot of your listeners are native speakers of English, in which case it's absolutely a normal procedure to be carrying out text modulations of a certain type. But it's exactly those that shouldn't be applied to the non-native text, always assuming that non-native text has reached certain minimal levels of acceptability.
Mm-hmm. And right. And so for you, how do you scale back the red pen, like your work at the Language Advisory Service and Terminology Unit?
Yeah.
How do you rein that in, and what's your approach to?
It's a very good question. Again, I mean, I'm sounding quite boring here. I have to point out that I haven't been in that job for a long time, and I no longer work in that unit. But I headed it up for quite a few years, and we had quite clear protocols on how to work. The first thing that we would do is, if we received a text that was simply inadequate, we would reject it, because a lot of people in our context, in general context, translation is a lot more expensive than text correction. So people would, instead of sending us text to translate, which we could also do, they would send any old stuff in the hope that it could be edited at about 30% of the cost. So we had to be very clear that, we had clear filters not to allow that to happen. So if a text was simply not acceptable, then we either recommended that it be translated or it be rejected. But in the case of those texts where the language was perfectly comprehensible, then our basic form of proceeding was to add comments to the text and constantly invite our authors into a kind of conversation. So we would say things like, is this what you mean here? You do have this alternative form. Do you prefer that, or are you okay with that? And it takes more time, but it's very, very rewarding. And I should also add that some authors don't like that approach at all. They'll say, what are you asking me that for? You're the experts.
Go forward.
But then when we say to them, okay, but this is your text. It's not going out in my name. And I want you to be happy with what you have here. So there was a lot of communication involved in that. And that was very, very productive. And that was essentially our way of proceeding.
Right. And as long as you have those communication lines open, beforehand, you'll know if the author is one who, kind of wants to retain some terms of phrase, or if, they want to just say, go forth and mark it up and I'll
And do
deal
it.
with
Yeah,
it later.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly. Yeah.
And in which case, there's absolutely no problem. Of course, you just go ahead and do that.
Right. Yeah. And so the concept of the correction certificate was really interesting to me.
Yes.
I hadn't heard of that before. And, I'm not sure if if the unit is still issuing those for
They do.
authors, but
They do. Yeah.
yeah. So
I'm in
can you,
close contact with my colleagues. So, yeah.
okay. Yeah. So can you explain like what it is and why it would benefit authors if they have one?
Sure. Um, the certificate came about because basically lots of people would ask us for a letter. They would say, listen, the publishers say that it's okay, but they don't trust me. So can you write a letter saying that you've looked at it and it's okay? So this is even without modifying the text. And another proof of the fact that
Wow.
if you're, if you happen to be called Pedro Lopez, then, the barriers are going to come up. So, we'd have to send a letter in saying, we've looked at this and it's fine and it can go ahead and it get published. And then we thought, well, we might as well just, consolidate that into a certificate. So we produced a certificate which, in a sense, is playing a game. I would rather there were a world in which certificates weren't necessary for these texts. But it's a way of getting the text past the gatekeeper. So the gatekeeper will look at the certificate and say, okay, a native speaker has looked at this and that's fine. Although the certificate, doesn't make the claim that we're native speakers and that it has been validated. But what the certificate does is it says, this text is comprehensible. It doesn't violate any grammatical norms. It's perfectly acceptable from the point of view of its lexis, of its orthography, and so on and so on. But it has a second pedagogical point, which is to say that the comprehensibility of the text is the thing that we value the most here, that it is expressing what it wants to say in a way that is clear. I'm not sure if people who received that certificate actually sat down and read it thoroughly and thought, well, maybe I need to rethink my whole attitude towards nativeness. But what I do know is that with the certificate, none of our texts were ever rejected, certainly while I was in the unit. And that's why they may have modified the wording now, I don't know. But I know that it's an integral part of the correction process, of their editing process, so that texts are submitted to academic journals with that certificate and it works.
Right. And you say, you're playing the game, but, it's kind of a way to work within that system.
Within that system, exactly that.
Right. And so much of this is a mindset shift for our listeners, for, me as an editor. I'm always thinking about these things, but also like putting it into practice is completely different,
It is.
Depending on our client and, just all these other
Absolutely.
factors.
Yeah.
So, for our listeners who are open to that mindset shift, do you have any suggestions on maybe how they can be more mindful of this, or how they can raise their consciousness and other editors' consciousness about international English?
Yes. That's a really good question. Let me say, as a way to answer that I'm very aware that my own context as an editor is very, very different from yours. I was working in a university in Barcelona, which is a multilingual city. There are 2 official languages as well as English. So this whole thing was much, much more natural to our way of working than it would be for somebody working in Ohio. Not that you don't have a multiplicity of languages, but it's like being somewhere in Britain. That Britain is also a multilingual country, but you wouldn't necessarily know it if you went there. You just hear English all the time. So it's very normal if editors listening to us feel that this has no resonance with their world, and it may never have. But if it does, and if they're open to that mindset change, as you're suggesting, Cynthia, then I think there are several things that can be brought into play that are helpful. One of them is thinking of your own language learning experience. Most people, even if they don't have advanced competences in another language, have studied language at some point and have some ideas of what language is like. By forcing yourself to imagine yourself trying to publish in another language is a very, very simple and very effective and absolutely cost-free way of
Right. Yeah.
reflecting a little bit on your own praxis, because you'll suddenly see how extraordinarily complex it must be to write at native-like level in another language. And that in itself might slow down a little bit the red pen coming out so often, because you think, well, these people have made a great effort to do that. But in addition to that, I think, especially in journal publication, one of the things that would be very helpful is training. Training for editors, training for journal managers. And by training, I mean access to a lot of work that's been done, and I imagine the last 15 years has been developed even further in developing international English corpuses, so that there's just a general awareness of how international communities are managing their ownership of English. There are common phonetic agreements, there are common lexical corpuses, there are slightly simplified grammatical rules and regulations. So an awareness of that, not as a simplification of language, but as a commodification of language, would be one way of doing it. But it does take time, and I can absolutely understand that if you're not really in that context, it might sound exotic and interesting to you, but it's probably not likely to impact on your day-to-day work. If, on the other hand, you do work in multilingual communities, then that is exactly the kind of editor who needs to be thinking more carefully about their practice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I like that idea of editors are always, talking about empathy, right? So yes. I think putting ourselves in the writer's shoes, first and foremost, is a great idea. And yeah, I just personally am trying to figure out more, the research that's been done and this training. And it would be really interesting to me because one of the questions I always anticipate is, am I inviting chaos? Like, what am I arguing for, right? And you touch on that in the article. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see very easily that's a perfectly fair objection. It sounds like you're inviting chaos. In fact, I think if you learn, it's a question of learning to let go. It's learning to say, I'm okay with people owning English anywhere. It doesn't undermine my own ownership of the language. I have my own personal history with English. It's my language. I was born into it. My family speaks it. There are huge cultural connections to it that nothing will undermine, even if somebody in Indonesia feels that it's their language too. So let them have it.
Yes.
And, when you let that go, it's actually a really liberating feeling. And then you can start to see just how uppity we've been about it by, not letting these people get on and just try to communicate with us as best as they can.
It's just a communication, right? Yeah.
It's a communication. And the thing is, it doesn't invite chaos. I can see that, you think if you let those walls down, then the barbarians are going to come hurtling in. And the thing is, they're not barbarians. They're very well organized and they're interested in communicating effectively. So it's in their interests to be as effective communicators as possible. They're not looking for chaos. So I think it's an argument that's theoretical, but in the practical terms, it doesn't happen.
Yeah. And this is our first episode of this podcast, but now I want to change the title to Just Let Go. Like, just let go. For editors, just let go.
Just let go.
Just let go, yes. Okay, well, and so you talked a little bit throughout about the more you've thought about linguistic imperialism and your thoughts have changed. Have any of your other ideas on this evolved since the publication of the article? Like I said, it was 15 years ago.
Yeah. Yes, they have, but not so much, more the scope than the content. I think if I were writing this now, in the intervening years, I've become much clearer about how linguistic imperialism isn't first and foremost about the imperialists. It's about the people that they colonize. And I guess that's where it kind of connects more to kind of political imperialism. So my first concern about linguistic imperialism was that it was a criticism of the native speakers. We needed to be more generous, we needed to be more flexible. But now I'm thinking more of the consequences of that, which is the marginalization of the non-native, the way in which imperialism affects their ability in an equal way to get to the same opportunities for publication and for dissemination of research. And it just fits into a broader pattern of silencing voices because they're deemed to be somehow inferior. And so, I started by saying that I avoided the term linguistic imperialism because it sounded too political to me now. But now the more I think about it, the more obviously political it is. That doesn't mean that people are linguistically imperialist in a conscious way. Some people
Right.
obviously are.
Yeah.
But it's just that there's lots of low level linguistic imperialism that is just as detrimental.
Right.
And it is extraordinarily exclusive. I suppose that's probably how my thinking has developed over the years. It's moved more away from the people who are guilty, so to speak, of imperialism to the victims of imperialism.
Yeah.
If I can put it in those terms. I mean, it sounds
Yeah.
awful when you say it like that, but
I hear what you're saying, and the point you made in the article that there's no mastermind behind it, right?
no.
But I think that to me, I've read that as hopeful that we can do more to change it, right? Because there's no mastermind behind it.
Absolutely.
So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're right. And that's a very significant difference with political imperialism, because in political imperialism, there is a mastermind. You know,
Right.
there's somebody or some people who are trying to control things. That's not happening in language.
Right.
We all know linguistic snobs, but they're not out to conquer the world.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Right. Yeah. Very good. I learned so much from this article, and I'm gonna be thinking about it and going through the references list and everything for a while now. But is there anything that you'd like to share with our listeners? And I know now you're working in English literature, and I don't know if you want to say a little bit about what you're working on now.
And I'm not sure that anybody would be interested in it. My area of specialization is the English novelist Jane Austen.
Yes, I'm sure. Yes, editors love Jane Austen. Yes.
I love Jane Austen. I've spent my academic career working on Jane Austen, and so I that's what I do my research in, basically, Jane Austen's novels.
What do you think about all the movies and whatnot that are, it seems like every year there's a new,
that it's funny actually, because here we have another kind of imperialism too. I love the movies. I love them. I love all the adaptations. I love, all of the spin-offs, whether they're in literature like Pride and Prejudice and zombies and things like that. That's fantastic. I love the Emmas, and anything Regency is fun to me, because on a serious note, I think that's how culture persists over time. It makes itself relevant, and if culture is not relevant, then it ends up being locked up in a museum. But in the same way that the non-native speakers are rejected by the native speaker elitists in the academic world of Jane Austen, a lot of people don't like this at all, and they say no. The only Jane Austen is the true Jane Austen. The novels that she published, and any adaptation of that is a dumbing down of it. So curiously, I've ended up in the same position that I was 15 years ago, but now I'm talking about Jane Austen instead of the English language.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's something else. I hadn't thought about that, but yes, I can definitely see that being a debate. Yeah.
It is, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, Cynthia, for inviting me.
Okay, Eddie Buddies, I hope you enjoyed that discussion. You can listen to episodes of Talking Proper wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me on a journey to understand the power behind the profession we love. And remember, communication is the ultimate goal. It's okay to be flexible. Talking Proper is a production of Dragonfly, Editorial, and OutsideTheBook.com. Thanks to the folks at Clock Tower Media in Ohio for taking care of our production.